The day my only son, Daniel, looked me in the eyes and said, "Mom, you're nothing but a burden now." Something inside of me cracked so deeply that even my bones seemed to feel the weight of his words. And I knew that life as I had known it was never going to be the same again. But before I tell you about that terrible moment, I want to invite you, yes, you, watching this right now, to subscribe, like, and comment where you're from. Because stories like mine happen more often than people realize. And the only way we older folks can stand together is by sharing our voices so they echo across the world. Now, let me take you back to where it all began. A place that looked warm and safe on the outside, but was hiding a coldness that could chill even the strongest heart. I was 69 years old when it all unfolded, living in a quiet little town outside of Richmond, Virginia, a town where neighbors waved at each other from their porches, where church bells chimed every Sunday, where folks believed family was sacred. And for most of my life, I believed that too, especially when it came to Daniel, the boy I raised with my own two hands after his father passed away when he was only 12. I worked 3 jobs back then: nursing assistant during the day, diner waitress at night, and cleaning offices on weekends, just to keep a roof over our heads and to make sure Daniel could have the things other boys took for granted, like Little League uniforms, a used bike on his birthday, even braces when the dentist told me his teeth would cause him pain if I didn't do something. And through it all, I never complained because I told myself, one day, this boy will grow into a man who will honor the sacrifices his mama made, and he'll stand beside me when I'm old and tired. But as I've learned, dreams and reality don't always walk the same path. Daniel grew up handsome, ambitious, the kind of man who could charm a room the moment he walked in, and I was proud, so proud, when he became a real estate agent and started closing deals that earned him more money in a month than I'd ever seen in a year, and when he married a woman named Laura, who carried herself with a sharpness in her smile that I tried to overlook. I told myself that I was finally going to get to be the mother who could step back, relax, and maybe even be cared for instead of always being the caretaker. But the first crack in that fantasy came after I sold the little brick house Daniel grew up in, the one with the green shutters and the rose bushes I planted out front in memory of his father. Because Daniel told me, "Mom, you can't handle that house anymore. The upkeep, the yard, the repairs. You'll be better off with us." And I believed him, thinking I was walking into the arms of the family when I moved into the so-called guest suite in his shiny new suburban home. But what I didn't know then was that I was stepping into a trap designed not to give me comfort, but to wring every last ounce of usefulness out of me. At first, it seemed fine, even good. I cooked dinners for them, helped with the laundry, looked after their little girl Sophie, who was only 7 then. And in those early months, I convinced myself that I was contributing, that I was still valuable. But slowly, almost too quietly to notice, the balance shifted. Daniel began suggesting I chip in for the mortgage because, as he put it, "You're living here rent-free and it's only fair." And though his house had 4 bedrooms, 3 bathrooms, and a pool, he made me feel guilty for taking up space. So I handed him my Social Security checks every month, believing I was helping us all. I told myself family helps family, that maybe one day I'd need him more than ever, and this would prove my loyalty. But loyalty is a dangerous word when it's not returned, and soon enough, those checks weren't enough. Laura would leave bills on the kitchen counter with sticky notes that read, "Mom, can you handle this one?" Utilities, groceries, sometimes even credit card payments I knew weren't mine. And I paid them because the alternative was the silence, the cold stares across the dinner table, the subtle reminders that this house wasn't mine, and I should be grateful just to have a place in it. I kept quiet, told myself it was temporary, told myself grief after losing my husband had made me fragile and I needed time to find my footing. But deep down, I was afraid. Afraid that speaking up would mean losing the only family I had left. Afraid of being cast out into the world alone at nearly 70 years old with nothing but a dwindling bank account and tired knees that ached every time the rain came. Then came that winter morning, sharp and brittle as broken glass, when Daniel finally dropped the mask completely. I had just finished folding Sophie's laundry, the little pink pajamas with unicorns on them that made me smile because she reminded me of the sweet little boy Daniel once was, when he called me into the kitchen. Laura sat at the table, sipping coffee, her phone in one hand, her eyes gleaming like a cat who had cornered its prey. And Daniel said it with no hesitation, no apology, no hint of the boy I once tucked into bed. Mom, you're nothing but a burden now. And Laura and I have been talking. It's time you figured out how to take care of yourself without relying on us. And when I asked with my voice trembling what he meant, Laura set down her mug and said, "We don't need your little checks anymore. And honestly, it's exhausting having you here. So why don't you look into one of those senior apartments or government programs? You'd fit right in." And the way they both looked at me, like I was disposable, like I was a piece of furniture they were tired of tripping over, well, that's when something inside of me shifted from heartbreak to something harder, sharper, something that whispered, they don't even realize the storm they've unleashed. Because what they didn't know, what they had never bothered to ask, was that I had been playing the same lottery numbers for more than 30 years. Numbers that held the story of my life. Numbers that one December night finally changed everything. But before I get ahead of myself, let me just say this. Betrayal from a stranger cuts like a knife. But betrayal from your own flesh and blood, from the child you carried in your arms and fed with your own sacrifices, that cuts deeper than bone. It sears the soul, and it leaves scars you can't see but feel every time you close your eyes. And as I stood in that kitchen with my son and his wife dismissing me like yesterday's trash, I decided that if the world was going to know one thing about me, it was this. I may be old, but I am not finished, and I am not powerless. After Daniel and Laura delivered those words like a sentence being read in a courtroom, I retreated to the so-called guest suite, which was little more than a converted den with a fold-out couch and a bathroom that always smelled faintly of mildew, and I sat there, staring at the wallpaper until the hours blurred into one another, asking myself over and over how I had raised a son who could so easily erase me from his life. I remembered the nights I stayed up sewing his Halloween costumes because we couldn't afford store-bought ones, the mornings I walked him to school in the freezing cold, holding his tiny hand in mine, whispering encouragements when he cried about being teased for his hand-me-down clothes. And it felt like all of that love, all of that sacrifice had been rewritten into some twisted ledger where I was now a liability instead of the foundation that had carried him. The next days became a blur of silence, Daniel avoiding me with his real estate appointments, and Laura parading around the house like she had finally won a long-fought battle, leaving subtle hints that I needed to start looking into options, sliding brochures for senior living facilities under my door, the glossy photos of smiling gray-haired folks who looked nothing like me, people who had accepted their exile without a fight. But I wasn't ready to surrender to that fate. Every evening, Sophie would creep into my room, curl up beside me, and ask, "Grandma, are you sad?" And I would force a smile, stroke her hair, and say, "No, sweetheart, Grandma's just tired." Though inside my chest was a storm so loud it drowned out everything else. One night, I overheard Daniel and Laura arguing in their bedroom, Laura's voice sharp as a knife. "We can't keep covering for her, Dan. She's draining us. Your commission checks aren't enough to support 3 people." And Daniel's voice low, ashamed, but not enough to stop him. I know, but she has nowhere else to go. What do you want me to do?" And Laura snapped back, "I want you to grow a spine and tell her to leave. We need that money for us, not for her." And hearing my son's silence in that moment cut deeper than any words could, because silence, I realized, was his agreement. The next morning, Daniel came to me with papers. Papers that made my stomach twist. The deed to his house, or rather a loan modification document that would require me to co-sign so they could refinance and get cash out to pay off their credit cards and buy a new SUV. And he stood there with that salesman's smile I'd seen him use on clients, saying, "Mom, it's just a signature. You'll still live here. Nothing will change. But this will really help Laura and me get ahead." And for the first time, I saw not my son, but a man who viewed me as a tool, a signature on a dotted line, a means to an end. And I said no, quietly, but firmly. And the flash of anger in his eyes was something I will never forget because it was the moment he realized his control over me wasn't absolute. From that day on, life in that house became unbearable. Meals eaten in silence, Laura making snide remarks about dead weight, Daniel disappearing for longer hours, Sophie caught in the middle and clinging to me like a life raft. And all the while, I kept a secret tucked away in the back pocket of my worn-out purse. A lottery ticket with the same numbers I had played for 3 decades, numbers that meant love and loss and resilience. And though I didn't know yet what fate had in store for me, holding that ticket felt like holding a fragment of hope in a world that had turned hostile. One Friday night, the Powerball drawing came on the television in the living room. Laura sitting with a glass of wine, Daniel scrolling on his phone, and me in the corner folding laundry. And when the announcer read out the numbers 3, 12, 27, 34, 56, and Powerball 19, I froze, my hands trembling as I pulled the ticket from my purse. And for the first time in 30 years, my numbers matched every single one. I sat there, numb, while Laura prattled on about a vacation she wanted to book, and Daniel muttered something about the housing market. And I realized I was holding $68 million in my hands. Freedom, disguised as a flimsy slip of paper. My first instinct was to laugh, to scream, to run into the street and shout to the heavens. But instead, I tucked the ticket back into my purse, smoothed out the laundry, and said nothing. Because sometimes the sweetest revenge is silence. Over the next days, I watched them with new eyes. Laura bragging to her friends on the phone about Daniel's big deals, Daniel talking about buying a boat he couldn't afford, and Sophie tugging at my sleeve asking if we could bake cookies together. And all the while, I thought, you don't even know. You don't even see it coming. And for the first time in years, I felt powerful. But power, I learned, is also dangerous because it tempts you to act rashly. And I had to remind myself to be patient, to let them show me exactly who they were before I revealed what I now held. The breaking point came a week later, when Daniel stormed into my room, face red, holding a bill in his hand, shouting, "Mom, I need you to cover this. The mortgage is due, and I'm short. You've been living here for months without paying your fair share." And when I reminded him that I had already given him my checks, he slammed the paper down and hissed, "It's not enough. It's never enough. You either start contributing more or you're out." And in that moment, I realized he truly believed I was helpless, that he had me trapped, that he could squeeze me until there was nothing left. But oh, how wrong he was, because in my purse was not just a ticket, but a weapon. A key, a door to a future where I would no longer be a victim of his greed, but the author of my own freedom. And as I looked at his face twisted with entitlement, I thought of all the other mothers out there, women like me, who had given everything to their children only to be discarded like trash. And I silently vowed that when I walked out of this house, I wouldn't just be walking for myself, I'd be walking for them too. The morning after Daniel exploded at me about the mortgage, I sat at the edge of my narrow bed staring at the ticket hidden inside my worn leather wallet, the numbers glowing in my mind like a secret fire. And I knew I couldn't keep playing the helpless old woman they thought I was, not when I held enough money to rewrite my story from beginning to end. So I started planning, quietly, carefully. Because if there's one thing you learn as a mother, it's how to move silently while still getting things done. The way I used to tiptoe into Daniel's room to check on him when he was sick without waking him. Or the way I'd stretch grocery money until payday so he never realized how close we were to losing the house when he was young. Only this time, the stakes were higher than a missed meal or a late bill. This time it was my dignity, my independence, my future. And I wasn't about to let my own son gamble with it any longer. So I made an appointment with a lawyer I trusted from church, a woman named Rebecca Gray who had helped me draft a simple will years earlier. And I told Daniel I was going to the senior center for a knitting circle so he wouldn't question where I was going. And walking into Rebecca's office, with its polished oak desk and framed certificates, I felt something stir in me that I hadn't felt in years. Control. I showed her the ticket with trembling hands, and she leaned back in her chair, eyes wide, and then immediately grew serious, saying, "Dorothy, this changes everything, but you need to be very careful. People, especially family, can turn dangerous when this kind of money is involved. And I nodded because I already knew. I had seen the shadows in Daniel's eyes and the hunger in Laura's smirk. But hearing Rebecca say it out loud made it real. She explained the claiming process, the taxes, the option of a lump sum or annuity, and suggested setting up a trust to protect the money from predators. And by predators, she didn't mean strangers, she meant my own flesh and blood. And as I listened, I realized Harold, my late husband, had been right all those years when he told me, Dot, kindness is a gift, but if you give it to the wrong people, they'll sharpen it into a weapon against you. After the meeting, I walked out onto Main Street with the ticket tucked safely back into my wallet and a folder of legal papers under my arm, and the air felt lighter, as though for the first time in years, I wasn't being pushed down by invisible hands, but lifted by something bigger than myself. I stopped by the bakery on the corner, bought myself a cinnamon roll, and sat by the window eating it slowly, savoring the sugar, savoring the taste of freedom. But when I returned to Daniel's house, the walls closed in again like prison bars. Laura cornered me in the kitchen, her voice dripping with fake sweetness, asking if I'd thought about moving into one of those lovely retirement homes she'd found online. And I lied, saying I'd look into them, because the truth wasn't ready yet, not until the time was right. Meanwhile, Daniel's behavior grew more erratic, the bills piling higher, the phone ringing with calls he ignored, his temper flaring at the smallest things. And one night I overheard him on the phone with a friend saying, I swear, if Mom doesn't start pulling her weight, I'm going to have to cut her off completely. We can't keep carrying her. And I wanted to burst into the room and shout, carrying me? I've carried you for nearly 40 years. But instead, I held my tongue because I had a bigger plan. Each day, I began quietly packing little pieces of my life. My husband's photo, my mother's locket, my Bible, the quilt I'd stitched from Daniel's old baby clothes, small items hidden at the back of my closet so Laura wouldn't notice. Because one day soon, I'd be leaving, and I'd take my memories with me, not the resentment they tried to bury me under. But life has a cruel way of testing you when you're closest to escape. And 2 weeks before I was set to claim my winnings, Daniel came home in a panic, his tie loose, his face pale, waving a foreclosure notice in his hand, yelling at Laura about missed payments, and then storming into my room demanding, Mom, you need to help me. You have savings. You can't just sit there while we lose everything. And I stared at him, really stared at him, at this grown man with lines of stress on his face and anger in his eyes. And I realized he wasn't just asking for help, he was blaming me, as if it were my fault that his greed had dug them into a hole so deep they couldn't see daylight. And when I told him quietly, I don't have what you think I have, his face twisted into something I barely recognized, a sneer that made me flinch. And he hissed, then maybe it's time you left. Maybe we don't need you here after all. And I knew then that the son I had once cradled in my arms was gone, replaced by a man who saw me as an obstacle between him and the life he thought he deserved. That night, I sat awake long after everyone else had gone to bed, listening to the hum of the refrigerator and the creak of the house, and I promised myself that when the morning came, I'd stop hiding, I'd stop waiting for their approval, and I'd start building a new life, one they could never touch, one they'd never even see coming. The morning after that sleepless night, I put on my thickest winter coat, the one Daniel always mocked as old lady fashion, and walked straight to the bank, where I had kept the same checking account for over 40 years. And as I sat across from the teller, a young woman with a kind smile who called me ma'am, I felt the weight of years of invisibility lift just a little when I asked to open a safety deposit box, because I needed somewhere safe for the slip of paper that was about to become my salvation. And when the box clicked shut with that heavy metallic sound, it was like locking away not just the ticket, but every insult, every manipulation, every time Daniel and Laura made me feel like I was worthless. From there, I went to Rebecca's office again, and together we finalized the paperwork for the trust, the annuity plan, and a new will that would make sure Sophie, the only innocent one in this whole mess, would one day inherit something from me that couldn't be touched by her greedy parents. And as I signed my name on those crisp pages, my hands steady for the first time in years, I knew I was sealing a future that belonged to me, not to the people who had treated me like hired help. Meanwhile, back at the house, Daniel's desperation was thick in the air, like smoke from a fire that had been left to rage too long. He spent hours on the phone shouting at creditors, slamming doors, snapping at Laura until even she looked worn out, though she never missed a chance to remind me of how much pressure they were under, as if their mountain of debt was somehow my fault. One evening, when I was washing dishes after cooking them yet another dinner they never thanked me for, Laura leaned against the counter, swirling a glass of wine, and said with a smirk, "Dot, don't you ever get tired of being, well, unnecessary?" And I kept my back turned because if she had seen the fury on my face, I might have said things I could never take back. Daniel, for his part, grew harsher by the day. He would drop bills in my lap without a word, glare at me across the table, and once when Sophie asked if I could come to her school play, he snapped, "Grandma won't be around much longer, honey. Don't count on it." And the look on that little girl's face nearly broke me, but it also steeled me because I realized I wasn't just fighting for myself anymore. I was fighting for her, too, to show her that cruelty doesn't win, that dignity matters, that even when those closest to you betray you, you can still rise. In the quiet of my room, I rehearsed what I would say when the time came, the words I would deliver not in anger, but in truth, words that would slice through their illusions like glass shattering. But until that day, I played my part, keeping quiet, letting them believe I was beaten down, while inside me a storm of resolve was building. The week before I planned to drive to the lottery office in Richmond to officially claim my winnings, Daniel came home with a wild look in his eyes, holding a glossy brochure for a lakeside mansion, and he spread it across the kitchen table like a child showing off a prize, saying, "This is where we'll be in a year, Laura. 5 bedrooms, a dock, maybe even a boat." And Laura clapped her hands like an excited teenager, already decorating it in her mind. And I sat silently in the corner, folding Sophie's homework papers, thinking, "You're already counting money that isn't yours." And my silence tasted sweeter than any words I could have spoken. But the cruelty didn't stop. 2 nights later, Daniel barged into my room without knocking, waving another overdue notice. And when I told him calmly, "I can't give you what you're asking for," his face twisted and he shouted, "Then you're no use to me anymore, Mom. Do you understand? You're nothing but dead weight." And the venom in his voice didn't just sting, it seared. But I sat there, hands folded in my lap, letting him spit his anger, because the truth was, the more he revealed of his heart, the easier it was for me to let go of the boy I once loved. When he stormed out, slamming the door so hard the frame rattled, I whispered to myself, "Patience, Dot, just a little longer." And in that moment, I felt Harold, my late husband, as if he were sitting right beside me, whispering in my ear like he used to, "Stand tall, Dorothy. Don't let them take your soul." The next morning, as the sun broke through the blinds, I knew I was ready, not just to claim the money, but to claim myself, to step out of the prison they had built around me, to show them that the mother they had dismissed as weak had been stronger than they ever imagined. And though they didn't know it yet, the reckoning was coming, swift and unstoppable, like a storm that had been gathering for years, and this time I would be the one holding the lightning. The day I finally walked into the Virginia Lottery headquarters in Richmond, clutching my purse with the safety deposit key inside, I felt like a soldier marching into battle. Not against strangers, but against the 2 people who had shared my dinner table for years, while quietly bleeding me dry. And as I sat in that sterile office with its fluorescent lights and stacks of forms, listening to the clerk read through the process of claiming $68 million, I felt my body trembling, not with fear, but with release, like shackles falling away after decades of servitude. Rebecca, my lawyer, sat beside me the whole time, her calm presence steadying me as I signed the papers that turned my life from survival into sovereignty. And when the official shook my hand and congratulated me, I almost wanted to cry. Not because of the money itself, but because of what it meant. But I was no longer trapped, no longer at the mercy of Daniel's temper or Laura's cruel remarks, no longer an old woman begging for scraps of dignity in a house that was never mine. On the drive home, I kept glancing at the packet of documents on the passenger seat, and with each mile closer to Daniel's house, I rehearsed in my mind what I might say, how I might finally show them the truth. But when I pulled into the driveway, Laura was already waiting on the porch, her eyes sharp, her phone glued to our hand as if she were anticipating news, and I realized with a sick twist in my stomach that they had no idea what had happened yet. No clue that the woman they dismissed as worthless had just become wealthier than either of them could dream. I went inside quietly, placing the papers in my room, and sat for a long while in silence, just listening to the sounds of their lives unraveling in the next room. Daniel cursing into his phone at a creditor, Laura scolding Sophie for spilling juice, the television blaring some reality show where everyone argued about nothing, and I thought, they think they're the ones running this house, but they don't even see the ground shifting beneath their feet. That night, after Sophie had gone to bed, Daniel knocked on my door, his voice honeyed in a way that made my stomach churn, and he said, "Mom, Laura and I have been talking, and we really want you to feel secure here, but, well, we need some financial help to make that happen." And I almost laughed at the timing, at the audacity of him walking in that very evening, asking for money while I had just secured more wealth than he could fathom. But instead, I asked, "What kind of help?" And he laid out bills, mortgage arrears, and a plan to invest in his business if only I could give him a loan of $20,000, promising it would be temporary, promising I'd never regret it. And I stared at my son, my only child, my baby who I once held against my chest, and I saw not desperation but calculation in his eyes, a gambler holding out his hand for one last chip. I told him I didn't have that kind of money, and his face darkened, the charm evaporating like mist, and he muttered, "Then maybe you really don't belong here anymore," before slamming the door behind him, leaving me in the dim light with the sound of my heart pounding. The next morning, I left before dawn, driving back to Richmond, not to sign more paperwork, but to open a new chapter of my life. Rebecca had found me a beautiful two-bedroom apartment in a senior community across town with a balcony that overlooked the James River, and when I stepped into that bright, sunlit space, I felt 20 years younger, lighter, freer. And as I unpacked my small box of belongings, I realized this was the first space in years that was truly mine, untouched by bitterness or cruelty. That night, I sat on the balcony, the city lights shimmering below, the lottery documents in my lap, and I thought of Daniel and Laura in their darkened house, counting bills, drowning in debt, completely unaware that the woman they dismissed as worthless had just become wealthier than either of them could dream. And the sweetness of that secret was almost as satisfying as the win itself. But secrets have a way of surfacing, and I knew it was only a matter of time before they discovered the truth, and when they did, the reckoning would come. Not just with words, but with the undeniable force of consequences. And when that day arrived, I vowed to stand tall, to let them see exactly what it means when a mother who has been underestimated finally takes back her power. It didn't take long for the secret to slip, because small towns are like sieves when it comes to gossip. And one morning, about a week after I'd settled into my new apartment overlooking the river, my phone buzzed with a flurry of messages from old church friends, neighbors, even the clerk from the grocery store, all of them congratulating me with too many exclamation points. And before I could even catch my breath, there was a pounding on my door that rattled the frame. And when I opened it, there stood Daniel and Laura, their faces pale and frantic like two gamblers who had just realized the dealer had been holding a royal flush the whole time. "Mom, what is this we're hearing?" Daniel demanded, waving a folded newspaper that blittered across the front page. "Local senior wins $68 million Powerball jackpot!" And beneath it, a grainy photo of me leaving the lottery office, clutching Rebecca's arm with a stunned smile. Laura pushed past him into my living room without waiting for an invitation, her perfume filling the air like poison, and she hissed, "You didn't tell us, Dot! You didn't even give us a chance to celebrate with you, to help you. How could you keep something like this from your family?" And I closed the door gently behind them, leaning against it, taking a moment to breathe, because I had been waiting for this confrontation, had rehearsed it in my mind every night since the drawing. But even so, hearing their outrage made my stomach twist. "Family," I said softly, my voice steadier than I expected. Is that what you call what you did to me? Charging me rent, demanding my checks, planning to throw me into a retirement home like yesterday's garbage? Daniel's jaw tightened, but Laura was quicker on the defense, her eyes darting to the balcony door as if calculating the square footage, already thinking about what she could take. And she said, "We were under pressure. You know that. We never meant to hurt you, but we're in this together, right? I mean, this money, it's not just yours. It's for all of us, for the family." The gall of her words almost made me laugh, but instead I sat down calmly on the couch and folded my hands in my lap, staring at them like strangers, because in truth, that's what they were now. "The ticket was in my name," I said. "I bought it. I kept those numbers alive for 30 years while you two are busy living beyond your means. This money is mine, and I intend to use it to live the rest of my life in peace." Daniel's voice cracked as he barked, "That's not fair! You wouldn't be here without us! We gave you a home and Dad died! We took care of you!" The fury that bubbled up inside me nearly spilled over, but I kept my composure because I wanted every word to cut with precision. "I took care of you?" I asked. "You charged me $1,200 a month for a fold-out couch and used my Social Security to pay your bills. You treated me like a maid, like a burden, like an inconvenience. That's not care, Daniel. That's exploitation." His face darkened, and Laura, sensing his anger, shifted gears, her tones softening, her hands clasping together in a practiced gesture of sincerity. "Dot, listen. We made mistakes, okay? But we can fix this. You're older. You don't need the stress of managing this kind of money. It's dangerous. People will take advantage of you. Let us handle it for you. We can invest it, grow it, make sure you're safe." I stared at her, remembering the time she left a bill under my door with a sticky note that said, "Handle this," and wondered if she even heard herself. "Safe?" I said. "From who, Laura? From you?" She bristled, but Daniel jumped in, pacing now, running a hand through his hair like he used to when he was caught lying as a teenager. "Mom, you're being unreasonable. This is too much for you. You need us." His voice cracked on that last word, need. And it was then I realized the truth. They weren't angry that I had the money. They were terrified that I no longer needed them. Terrified that the chains they'd wrapped around me had been broken by a single piece of paper. I stood, my knees aching but steady, and walked to the door, opening it wide. "I think it's time you left," I said, my voice low but firm. Laura's mouth fell open, her perfectly manicured nails gripping the back of a chair as if she might anchor herself there by force. But Daniel grabbed her arm, his face a mix of rage and desperation. "This isn't over, Mom. We're family. You can't just cut us out. You owe us." I looked at him then, really looked at him. The man who used to hold my hand at the county fair, who used to cry when he scraped his knee, who once whispered to me, "Don't ever leave me, Mama." And I felt the ache of what I had lost, but also the clarity of what I had gained. "You don't owe me anything," I said quietly, "and you'll see soon enough that sometimes, when you push someone too far, they finally learn to stand tall." And with that, I shut the door on my son for the first time in my life, my heart pounding like a drum in my chest. Knowing the battle was far from over, but also knowing that for the first time, I wasn't the one who had something to lose. The days that followed were a storm of calls, knocks, and letters slipped under my apartment door. Daniel's handwriting scrawled in angry loops, Laura's messages dripping with false sweetness. And though I ignored them all, each attempt reminded me of the years I had spent dancing to their tune, the way they had used guilt as a weapon, twisting my love into a leash. But now every ring of the phone, every pounding at the door only strengthened the wall I was building around myself. One evening, Daniel managed to catch me in the lobby of the building, his voice lowered to that boyish tone he used to use when he wanted an extra cookie after dinner, saying, "Mom, please, can we just talk? I didn't mean the things I said. We were under so much stress. You don't know what it's like. The debt, the pressure. It made me act out of character." And for a moment, my heart faltered because for just a flicker of time, I saw the child I once loved. But then he added, "If you could just let me manage part of the money, we could all be okay again." And the words sliced through the illusion because they weren't about love. They were about access, about control, about the same old hunger wearing a new mask. When I shook my head and stepped past him, Laura appeared outside, leaning against their SUV with her arms crossed, her lips pursed into a tight line, and she called out, "You're embarrassing us, Dot. People are talking. Do you really want your granddaughter growing up thinking her grandmother abandoned her family?" And the cruelty of using Sophie's name as leverage nearly broke my resolve, but I reminded myself that love for Sophie meant showing her a different way to live, one where respect wasn't bartered like currency, and I walked upstairs without another word. Later that week, a letter arrived in the mail, thick and formal, stamped with an attorney's office I didn't recognize, claiming Daniel and Laura intended to contest ownership of the lottery ticket, arguing that since I lived in their home at the time of the purchase, the winnings should be considered shared family property. And though my hands shook reading it, Rebecca assured me it was nonsense, that the law was clear, but still the audacity left me breathless. My own son willing to drag me through court to steal what he hadn't earned. That night, as I sat by the window with the city lights flickering below, I thought of Harold again, of the quiet strength he had carried through his own struggles, and I whispered aloud, "I won't let them break me, Harold. Not this time." The next day, Laura cornered me at Sophie's school play of all places, dressed in pearls and a fake smile, whispering in my ear as the children sang, "Dot, you're destroying this family. You think Sophie won't notice when you disappear from her life? If you cared about her, you'd keep us all together." And I turned to her, staring straight into her carefully painted eyes, and whispered back, "If you cared about Sophie, you'd have treated her grandmother with love instead of contempt." And the way her face twisted told me the mask was finally slipping. From that moment on, their tactics grew darker. Calls late at night with Daniel threatening, "You'll regret this, Mom. I swear you will." Emails from Laura claiming she'd tell the world I was senile and unfit to manage money. Even a visit from a social worker after someone anonymously reported me as incapable of independent living. But every attempt only backfired because Rebecca had prepared me, had put my finances in order, had connected me with the community center where I was volunteering now, reading to children and sharing meals with other seniors who, like me, had stories of betrayal by the very people they raised. And with each connection, I felt my spine straighten, my voice grow louder, my heart steadier. I was no longer just Dorothy, the tired widow in her son's house. I was Dorothy, the woman who had survived loss, exploitation, and loneliness, and who had risen from it with fire in her chest and clarity in her soul. But I knew this wasn't the end. Not yet. Because Daniel and Laura weren't the type to slink away quietly. They were circling, desperate, looking for a final way in. And I realized that if I wanted true peace, I couldn't just defend myself. I had to confront them head on, to strip away the illusions once and for all. And so I called Rebecca and said, "It's time for a family meeting," my voice steady as steel. And when she asked if I was sure, I answered, "Yes, they've taken enough of my life. It's time they face the truth of what they've done." The night of the family meeting, I sat at the long oak table in Rebecca's office, the same one where Harold and I had once signed our wills. And as I laid out a folder of documents, I felt none of the trembling that used to seize me in Daniel's kitchen when he demanded money. None of the shame Laura tried to pour over me like poison. Instead, I felt calm, sharp, as though every scar they had given me had hardened into armor. And when they finally walked in, Daniel red-faced and restless, Laura with her polished smile hiding a storm, I didn't flinch. I simply gestured to the chairs and said, "Sit." And for the first time in years, they obeyed without a word, because something in my eyes told them this wasn't the mother they thought they could bully. Rebecca began, her voice steady, reminding them that the lottery ticket was purchased in my name, with my money, and was legally mine, no debate possible. But I raised my hand to stop her, because I wanted them to hear it not from a lawyer, but from me. So I leaned forward, my voice low, but cutting through the silence like a blade, and said, "You treated me like a tenant, A maid, a nuisance, all while bleeding me dry of every penny and ounce of energy you could take. But what you never understood is that you can't bury a woman who has already walked through fire. And I slid across the table the receipts of every Social Security check I had handed them, the notes Laura had left me demanding I cover bills, the list I had kept of hours I spent raising their daughter, cooking their meals, cleaning their house, all unpaid, all unacknowledged, and their faces shifted from arrogance to unease as the truth stared back at them in black ink. Daniel tried to bluster, insisting, "We gave you a home when Dad died. You would have been lost without us." But I cut him off with a sharpness that startled even me. "You didn't give me a home. You sold me one, and at a price higher than any stranger would have charged. And then you had the nerve to plan my exile into a basement, like a dog to be kennelled out of sight." And Laura flinched, her polished nails tapping nervously against the table, while Daniel's eyes darted to Rebecca, perhaps hoping she would intervene, but she stayed silent, letting me hold the floor. I pulled out the last folder, Harold's secret file, the one he had given to Rebecca years earlier, and I spread it open for them to see. The mountain of debt they had hidden, the credit cards maxed out, the mortgage underwater, the cars they couldn't afford, the truth of their lives written out like a confession. And I said, "Your father knew. He knew you'd tried to use me. He tried to prepare me. And now here we are, just as he feared, with you demanding a share of something you never earned while your own lives crumble from your choices." And Daniel's face crumbled, anger giving way to something closer to panic, while Laura whispered, "This isn't fair, Dot. You can't just leave us like this. We're family. Sophie needs stability." And at that, my heart ached, because Sophie was the only one innocent, the only one who loved me without conditions. And I looked at them both and said, "I've set up a trust for Sophie. She'll be cared for. She'll have a future brighter than the one you two are dragging her into. But not a dime of my money will pass through your hands ever again." And Laura gasped like I had struck her, while Daniel slammed his fist on the table, shouting, "You can't do this to us!" And I stood, my chair scraping against the wood, my voice rising for the first time, strong and unshaken. "I am doing this because for the first time in years I can, and because I finally see you both for what you are, leeches who mistook my love for weakness, who forgot that the same woman who raised you through poverty, who buried her husband and kept moving forward, can also bury her patience and rise up stronger." And for a long, heavy moment, none of us spoke, the silence louder than any argument, until finally Daniel sagged back in his chair, his face pale, his eyes empty, while Laura's lips trembled, but no words came. I gathered my papers, tucked them into my bag, and walked to the door, pausing only once to look back at the two people who had cost me years of peace, who had mistaken my age for fragility, my grief for surrender. And I said, "You once told me I was nothing but a burden. Remember this night, because now you are the burden, weighed down by your own greed, and I am free." And then I left them sitting in that sterile office, their world crumbling, while mine was only just begun. As I stepped into the cold night air, the wind sharp against my face, I felt Harold's presence again, steady and proud. And I whispered to him, "It's done." But deep inside, I knew this wasn't the end. Not really. Because betrayal like theirs has a way of lingering like a shadow. And though I had won this battle, the war for my peace would continue as long as their hunger burned. Yet I also knew this: they would never again have power over me. And if you're listening, if you're watching, take this truth with you. Never let anyone, not even the ones you love most, convince you that your worth is theirs to measure. Because one day, like me, you may find the strength to turn their betrayal into your freedom. And when that day comes, it will be the sweetest victory of all.